Back when my oldest two, I've got two older ones that you don't know of that well that are in college right now. Back when they were in a youth group in Hannibal, Missouri, we did something every year. We tried to do this called Secret Meeting of the Saints. And our kids loved this. We would section off Hannibal, Missouri into a certain area, and we would declare that zone in Hannibal, Missouri no longer the United States of America. You are now in an Eastern Bloc type environment, and we put 50 kids into that area, and they were to go out there, and then we designated adults as secret police or safe houses where these kids could go. And they had one objective, and that was to go out into that zone and try to keep from being arrested as they tried to practice their faith in God. They would try to find a place where they could have an underground church and not be located by the secret police and brought back. Our church was transformed into a prison. So if they were caught, they were brought back to the prison and interrogated about their faith. I was one of the secret police. And me and another guy, we were bad cop, bad cop. When we went out there, nobody had any rights. We had certain houses that were designated as houses these kids could go to. We could go to those houses. We didn't have to show a warrant. We could search the houses. I found a whole bunch of kids in a garage hiding in a car in one of those houses, loaded them up in my van, and took them to jail because they were, out of order in our society. And the reason we did that, we wanted the kids to get a sense of what it would be like to live under a different type of government. And hopefully they would appreciate our style of government more so and appreciate their faith in Christ and not take for granted their ability to exercise that faith in Christ. That's the lesson we all need to learn. Now, Paul is writing important things to the church. And part of what he writes has to do with government. He's writing to Rome. People in the book of Romans, he's writing to the church in Rome, and he's addressing them with regards to the government that they're under in a very close proximity because they are in the actual city of Rome. And he's writing to them regarding those things. And in chapter 12, he's been talking about our individual responsibilities that we have in our walk with Christ. And now he diverts a little bit and talks about our responsibilities, reminds us how we're to respond to the government that we live under. And for Paul, the question is not whether you as a Christian are involved in government, but how can you be a Christian and not be involved in government is the question he might ask. That we have a responsibility, recognizing that government is something that was God's idea. And although we are called out of this world, we're called to be citizens of heaven, yet we need to be the best citizens of earth that there are running around. So we're going to look at that this morning. I'm going to ask if you'd join me in standing, and we're going to read 7 verses out of Romans chapter 13. And this is one of the more important, as I've gotten close to this morning, I realize this is a very important message that we're going to look at this morning, not because that I'm preaching it, because of what is contained and what it should direct us to contemplate about our walk with Christ and our citizenship in this nation. Anyway, starting in verse 1, it says this. It says, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Would you bow with me in prayer? Father, we do praise you and thank you this morning for the freedom that we do enjoy in this country. And Father, I pray that you would challenge our hearts about how we handle that freedom. And Father, help us to be more passionate, to use that freedom to reach out for the purposes of the kingdom of God. Father, we do thank you for our church. We thank you for Christians all across this nation, all across this world. And Father, I pray that we would be the kind of citizens that we need to be salt to a place of darkness and decay, to be light that we need to be so that people can truly understand what it means to know you and to serve you and to live for you in this world. Father, we ask that you speak to us through these verses that we have read. Ask that you would help, just allow your Holy Spirit to help each one of us to recognize our place, to be convicted of maybe what we've not done, or convicted to do some things that are very important, especially this week, that we might encourage others about what it truly means to be a faithful Christian and the kind of citizens we need to be in this country. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, back in 1930, there was an election, and it was in the town of Wilton, Washington. And one of the candidates, which appeared on the ballot for committeeman, was Boston Curtis. Boston Curtis was encouraged to run by the mayor of that town. And the mayor wanted to see how many people would vote for this candidate, because how many people would vote for a candidate, actually, without knowing enough about that particular candidate. And he proved his point because Boston Curtis won that election in that town. Boston Curtis was his mule that he put on the ballot and was elected. And I'm afraid that we run into that more than ever in this nation, where we have a manufacturing of certain candidates and presented them, and we don't know in depth enough about people that we're allowing to lead us and voting for those folks. So knowing about government and understanding government, being involved to the level of understanding what you are choosing, what you are voting for, what you are supporting, is certainly a very important thing. And Paul makes a statement that helps us to define government when he says every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, which is a strong statement. That's a strong statement that tells us that we need to recognize our own responsibility to support the authorities that God places in our life. It goes on to say, for there is no authority except from God, and those who exist are established by God, that they are ordained by God. And that's a significant word. But that brings up an issue, because, of course, our nation was started by a response to an authority that was suppressive to them, and that's where the United States of America and the War of Independence happened. So these verses that we're going to look at need to be taken with the right understanding. You know, Hitler, his favorite verse in the Bible, or passage in the Bible, is the one we're preaching on this morning. He used this to keep the churches in Germany, as best he could, from reacting against his leadership. And if you've ever heard of the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose picture is up there, he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. He was one of the pastors that rejected that ideology and went and formed an underground movement, Christian movement, in Germany during World War II, or during Hitler's reign over that country. And so he represents what we also find in the Bible at different points, where you find a Daniel who is told not to pray, and yet he continues to pray. You find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are told to bow down to a golden idol representation of the ruler, and they refuse to do that and are thrown in the fiery furnace, and God rescues them from that. You find Peter and John, who are going and doing God's will, and they are told to stop sharing this message about Jesus Christ, and their response is, we must obey God rather than man. So this is not a blanket statement saying that government or authorities are allowed to push anything upon our lives. But the principle is there of being responsible citizens under the authorities that are there in a way that is honoring to God. Warren Wiersbe says this, that God has established or ordained 3 different institutions. God has ordained, number 1, you see them up there, the home, the church, and government. That means it is God's idea. That when God put humankind together, that he knew there needed not to be chaos, but there needed to be organization of leadership. And so government was one of the things that he put together. Now, what if the government is bad? What if the government is bad? We are reading the Apostle Paul, who was writing in a time when there was an edict out that banned Christianity. Christianity was made illegal by this government that he is writing under. It was made illegal because Christians, unlike other forms of religion during that time that were willing to acknowledge Caesar as a god, Christians wouldn't do that. And so when that was recognized, Christianity was made illegal. This was written when Nero was in power, that guy over there on that side, when he was in power, and he was one of the most wicked leaders that there was. This was written when the government that crucified Jesus was still in power. And this was written when most of the leaders of the Roman world, most of the emperors, were homosexuals. So this was Paul writing with that type of government. It wasn't the perfect government that he was writing these words under. He says literally, the powers that be, when he talks about governing authorities. That means when he wrote this, he didn't just talk about the emperors, the higher levels, like our presidents and Congress, people like that. All those who are in authority. I don't know if they had dog catchers in Rome, but if they had a dog catcher and that person had some authority, we needed to recognize that authority is what he's saying, the powers that be. That we need to acknowledge that. Verse 2, he says, therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinances of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. This is an important principle, is what he's saying. To respond to the authorities you can, as best you can, and still honor God. Now, when you think about a question or a passage like this, if I asked you what is the best kind of government, your hand would probably shoot up and you'd say, I know, it's a democracy. Well, there are all types of government that God has worked through. Paul, again, is writing under the Roman rule, and there are different types of government. There's a monarchy, there's an oligarchy, which is a few people ruling. Rome had gone through different types of rulership, a republic, a principate, which is where the person who's in charge, it kind of earns that position like the Catholic Church picks a pope. They find somebody they think is worthy of that position. And it had gone to be now an empire. And an empire has an emperor, and it had become where the emperor's heir had become the next one, whether they were good or bad. And that was where Paul was writing from as far as the government that was over the land at that time. Now, you might be surprised that we don't live in a democracy. If you ever stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag and to the democracy for which it stands, you'll realize that doesn't sound right, because it's to the republic for which we stand. We live in a republic that has some democratic things that we do in order to elect people to certain positions. If this was a pure democracy, then that would be majority rule at the ballot box. We could vote in anything and everything that we wanted as far as moral issues. And you can see where we are kind of moving that way, but we're not established that way. We were established to be a republic which recognizes that there are certain things that are always right, certain things that are always wrong, and those things are never up for vote. Those are our inalienable rights. Those are our Bill of Rights. Those aren't to be questions or put up for vote, because as a republic, we recognize those things are set. And we vote for certain things in order to keep the democratic processes going so that we can elect leadership at certain levels. You know, the missionaries, if you would question them, they might debate whether our free society is the best environment to produce dynamic Christianity. We think it's the best environment for Christianity to survive in or to flourish in. There are a lot of people around the world that are very dynamic in their faith, and a lot of churches around the world in very suppressive areas. Paul is writing in a time when the government was very suppressive to the church, and the church was flourishing. But the point not to miss here is that God has the ability to accomplish His will in spite of even less than godly leaders or governments being in charge. That God can still accomplish His will. Daniel chapter 2 Verse 21 says this. It says, He removeth kings and setteth up kings. That God is at work in helping to lift up and pull down different types of leadership. Romans 9:17, Paul wrote this just a few chapters earlier. He said, For this very purpose I raised you up. He's talking about Pharaoh, to demonstrate my power in you, that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. God allowed a wicked man like Pharaoh, who's about as wicked as you can get tried to wipe out all the children that were in the time of Moses that belonged to the Hebrews to try to get that deliverer. This wicked guy. And yet it says here that I raised you up for my purpose, that I might demonstrate my power and raise up my name, that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. One of the things we need to understand is, as you look at the Bible, that part of the judgment of God is allowing wicked leadership to ascend for a time. And that's part of the judgment that God allows. And that is reflected in the forms of government. And God knows what the best time and place for certain governments is. You know, when Paul was writing and when Jesus was doing his ministry and lived on this earth, much of the environment of that time had been formed by the Greek culture and the Roman rule at that time. And it allowed the perfect environment for the gospel to be proclaimed to this world. Whenever Alexander the Great was conquering all that area, he would leave behind, and everywhere that he conquered, the Greek culture and the Greek language. And so by the time Jesus came along and Paul came along, the Greek language and culture was all throughout the land. So when the Bible was written in Koine Greek, which was the perfect language for the Bible to be written in because it has so many more words available than our English language has. It's like the difference between color TV and black and white TV. And it allowed a lot of clarity to what was trying to be taught, which there would be more confusion if it was written in a lesser language. And yet that language was known throughout the land. And the Roman rule allowed a peace and an ability to travel all through the area to allow Paul to go out and do some amazing things in building the church and going in all different areas. So it was the perfect time. You could not do what was done then, now, because of the restrictions and the problems and the language barriers. And yet God allowed it all to happen at the perfect time. God knows the best time and place for things to be set in place, different types of government, so that his purposes can be accomplished. You know, we understand that America has been blessed with a republic for some 230 years or so. And that is primarily because of the people we were in 1776 or in that time. John Adams, who was the second president, the first vice president, said this. He warned this in 1798. He said, Our form of government is meant for the rule of a religious and moral people. It is wholly inadequate for any other. Wholly inadequate. That whenever we become a people who don't have the same principle or conscience or religious convictions as they had when they formed this government, that this government would become, in his opinion, inadequate. Because there needs to be that restraint, that principle, that conviction, that character there so that it doesn't abuse the freedoms that are there, but it's held in check by faith in God and a recognition of a God that we are all accountable to. Otherwise, it could turn into something that could be dangerous. You know, God works through all forms of government, and God worked through that government that set in place America some 230 years ago. You know, Isaiah talks about his own experience in Isaiah 6. When he recognized that the only king he had ever known, Uzziah, had died. Uzziah had ruled 52 years. You know, it seems like a long time when a president has 2 terms in a row, and that's just 8 years. Imagine somebody ruling for 52 years. The only king he had ever known, the only governing person that he had ever known, finally dies, and Isaiah looks around and says, boy, are we in trouble. If you remember chapter 6, it says there that Isaiah had a vision. He says in the year that King Uzziah died, that he had a vision and he saw the Lord high and lifted up. No matter what is happening in human government, God is still on the throne. He is still ruling. He is still in charge. And we have seen through history that Christians have been under all types of governments. Some very oppressive, some very ridiculing of their faith, and yet God has remained on the throne and continued to work out his purposes. Now, part of what is written here is not just the acknowledgement that we need to be under the authorities as best we can as God's people, as citizens of heaven. We need to be the best citizens of earth that we can be. But it also says some things to the government about what their requirements are. Verse 3 says, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it's a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it's a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." Some of the things we know that government is supposed to do, number one, is to restrain evil. Is to restrain evil. If you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. The government has the God-given right to punish evil. That is part of the responsibility that government has. Now, somebody said this, that whoever coddles a criminal shows cruelty to a community. So when we stop as a people and our government stops punishing evil like it should, that's an offense against the whole community. In fact, Henry VIII was approached by some people to pardon a man who had committed murder. He pardoned that man. That man went out and committed another murder. He was arrested again. He was brought back, put in prison again. The same group came and asked for him to be pardoned again. Henry VIII said this. He says, "No, he killed the first man. I killed the second man. He will not get a chance to kill again." And our government needs to recognize that they have a responsibility from God to restrain, to punish evil. And I'm afraid that the focus today has moved away from focusing on restraining and punishing evil to forcing tolerance and the allowance of evil. They're more focused on that, often it seems like, than they should be from protecting us from acts of violence. I'm afraid sometimes that they're calling evil good and good evil more so than they're doing what they should be doing, restraining the evil as God defines it. It says here, government must punish evil responsibly. It does not bear the sword for nothing. There are lots of words for sword in the Bible, in the Greek language. This word for sword described a sword that was used in execution. This is a description of Paul talking about that the sword of capital punishment, of execution, which he would fall prey to eventually, was something that the government had a responsibility to bear. Now, if you've read your Bibles and you've looked at the system of dealing with criminals in the Bible, it doesn't say anywhere in Scripture that they are to build a jail, that they are to build a prison. When you look at what the Bible sets forth as the biblical pattern, it talks about restitution. It talks about certain penalties, a death penalty in some issues, and that there is even a person selling themselves in order to make restitution, if there's no other way, that they are to sell themselves into service to somebody else to pay back what they did. That is the biblical language, and Paul talks about that. I know capital punishment is one of those things that are debated in our society, but if you look at the Bible is very clear about what it says about that. Before the law, in Genesis 9:6, it says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, blood by man shall his blood be shed." Then you look at in the law, when the law was written, when Moses put it down, it says, "Thou shalt not kill." And the word for kill is the word for murder. It's not the word that would have been used for punishment or a death in war. And that's in Exodus chapter 20. But if you jump forward one chapter into Exodus 21, because some people will take that and say, well, we shouldn't have capital punishment because of that. But the very next chapter in the Bible says this: "He that strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death." So Moses is not loony. I mean, he knows what he's writing, one thing after another. And then you look at Jesus before Pilate, and Jesus says this as he stands before Pilate. He says, "Do you not know that I have the authority to crucify you?" This is Pilate saying this to Jesus. "I have the authority for capital punishment." And Jesus responds and says, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. And finally, after the gospel, we have Paul here affirming the right of government for a sword of execution. So that is not really a debatable thing if you are going to accept the biblical teaching on it. Government has a responsibility as the overriding principle to restrain evil even to that extreme point of doing it if necessary. The second thing that government has a responsibility to do is to reward good. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good and you will have praise from the same. You know, if you want to drive down the freeway without having to look in your rearview mirror every 2 seconds, don't drive 80 and a 40. Don't drive 80 and a 40. You won't have any fear. Somebody has said that the last part of our body to get saved is our right foot. You know, it always wants to go back to the old life and drive as fast as it can. But government should be encouraging that which is right. You know, nothing that is morally wrong should be politically right. And our government has a responsibility to create an environment of the right things being encouraged and supported by the government actions. It should honor good citizens, and it should support the right causes. You know, if you look at the phrase separation of church and state, you know, I would take you out for a steak dinner if you can find that in our Constitution. Because I know that you can't find that in our Constitution. That was a statement that came out of a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists, assuring them that the government would not mess with their religious freedoms. And it's not something that's in our Constitution. What is in our Constitution is this: government shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now remember the environment that all this was put together in. These are people who had come from different countries. In England, the Anglican Church ran things. If you went to Germany, the Lutheran Church ran things. If you were in Italy or France, the Catholic Church ran things. What they're saying is that government's not going to have a state church here. That people are going to be able to freely worship God as God would lead them in whatever denomination that might be. And the government is going to make no law establishing a religion. They're not going to make a state church. And they're also not going to prohibit the free exercise thereof. They're not going to say you can't pray here. I mean, this is the same government that put Scripture all over their buildings, all throughout all the documents they wrote. This is a government that tried to reach out to the northwest part of our nation and establish public schools for the purpose of teaching the Christian faith. So the separation of church and state that we find today is something that's also been maligned in a lot of ways. Government has a responsibility to reward good. It says here that government is to set the example by being servants of God. To be servants of God. That is how Paul defines what a government is to be. There was a man who was driving through a mining area, and he noticed a bunch of mules that had been let out in the pasture, and it's just something you don't often see, a bunch of mules together. And so he asked somebody about that, and they said these were the mining mules that were underground most of their lives, and they had to be brought out every once in a while lest they would go blind. If they stayed under there in that darkness all their lives, they would eventually lose their ability to see. So they had to be brought up every once in a while so that they would maintain their sight. And I think of that, and I think of our government needs the same thing. They need a breath of reality every once in a while to be brought out, especially to be exposed to the truths of Scripture and the truths of God so that they can be reintroduced and brought out of maybe a vacuum that exists in and reintroduced to the truths of what eternal truths really are. Ronald Reagan said this. He said, if we ever forget that we are one nation under God, then we will be one nation gone under. One nation gone under. We'll follow the same steps that England took. England used to have the greatest influence across the globe that there was. And they began turning away from God, and that influence began to diminish and to diminish and to diminish. England was going like this, like this, like this, and all of a sudden, as they rejected God and weren't as worshipful of God as they had been in the past, they began to lose their influence. And they're just another nation today, losing all the power that they once had. And America is following that same pattern. And I'm afraid we're losing our influence. I'm afraid we're losing our effectiveness as we've made some movements toward God that we've lost some blessing. Government is to reward good, to be a servant of God. Now, the last thing that Paul says here, starting in verse 5, he talks about our responsibilities as citizens. He says, therefore, because these things are true, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. That we are to be in subjection, not just in fear of wrath of being punished, but something that's of conscience. That we want to, by conscience, be the best citizens that we can under the authority that God has placed over us. Adrian Rogers says there's 5 things that we need to do as he looked at this with responding to government. He said, number 1, we need to pay for it. Render to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax, and custom to whom custom. You may not like how much you pay in taxes, but the principle of taxation is something that is important because we have to pay for those who are going to be in certain positions over us, that they have to be provided for. We need roads, we need sewers, we need bridges, we need armies to be provided for, we need city halls, we need policemen, firemen, and that takes us helping to pay for those things. But listen to this, the government is in trouble when half the people get the idea that they don't have to work because the other half will take care of them. The other half feels it does no good to work because so much of what they earn is taken away from them. So the principle of taxation needs to be responsibly done. In fact, France fell when the people saw the government as a cow to be milked instead of a watchdog to be fed. That's what somebody described the fall of France. When the people began to see the government as a milk cow rather than a watchdog to be provided for. You know, Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of our presidents back in the early part of the last century, he said there are things that will destroy America. These are the things that he picked out over 100 years ago. Prosperity at any price, peace at any price, safety first instead of duty first, the love of soft living, and a get-rich-quick theory of life. He said those things will destroy this nation. It's like he's a prophet, because those things are so much around us, so much of a part of our culture today. When you think about taxes, Jesus paid his taxes even. When he was approached by Peter once and said they want tax money from us, of course, Jesus had a way of doing it that I wish I could do. He said, go catch a fish, and Peter caught the fish, and there was money inside the fish. He said, use that to pay the taxes. Now, if somebody could fish like that, I'd be fishing. I don't fish enough, but I would be a fisherman if I could find money in these fish. Also, Jesus told us to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God. So he acknowledged also the importance of paying for government. But the second thing about government is we need to pray for it. Not just pay for it, but pray for it. 1 Timothy chapter 2, it says, first of all, I urge that. Pray for all those who are in authority, that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and tranquility. So part of what you do as a Christian needs to be prayer for those who are in authority. You may not like them. Pray that God will change their hearts. Pray that God will do a work through them. Because God can control the hearts of the kings, the rulers. And pray that God would use that power for them. The third thing we're to do is to praise government. It says, honor to whom honor is due. I'd encourage you this week maybe to walk up to a policeman and tell them how thankful you are for the protection they provide. To walk up to a fireman and thank them for the lives that they save. To find a soldier or a veteran and thank them for the freedom that we have. Honor to whom honor is due. To encourage them for the things they do for us. The next is participate in it. You render to Caesar not just your tax dollars, but you render your voice, your vote. You get active at some level to help make a difference in the right way. Because the climate that we live in is going to affect the cause of Christ. We need to participate in it. I came across this thing about the difference that one vote makes. You may have heard this before. But in 1645, Oliver Cromwell got control of England by one vote. In 1776, America, the English language was made the official language instead of German. You wouldn't understand if I was up here preaching in German today because that was our official language. You wouldn't know what I was saying. You can be thankful for that one vote, that made the difference there. 1845 kept Andrew Jackson from being impeached. 1876, one vote made Rutherford B. Hayes president. And in 1923, one vote gave Hitler leadership of the Nazi Party. So your one vote could make a big difference. And the last thing that you see up there is persuaded. The only hope for any people is truth. You know, the Bible even reinforces that the truth will set us free. And this nation is not going to hear truth anywhere else but the body of Christ. Because we should be the ones devoted to making sure they hear the truth that God has revealed and given to us and made us responsible to share to this world. We need to persuade this government. You look through the Bible and you can see that Nathan came to David at one point. You can see that Elijah stood before Ahab. You can see that Daniel stood before Nebuchadnezzar. That John the Baptist actually stood before Herod. And that we need to stand up and make sure that at least this nation's hearing the truth. Now somebody has said this. This is kind of a scary thing. Every nation gets the government it deserves. Every nation gets the government it deserves. That our government, if we got honest, is a reflection of who we are. The flaws that we have as a people is reflected and magnified in our government. And when we don't like what we see there, it's often because of what we really would see in the mirror if we looked hard enough. Back in the 1700s, this is a quote from the 1700s, the late 1700s. Somebody said this about democracy. They said a democracy can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. That word largesse is a word for money or gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses. The average age of the world's greatest civilizations has been 200 years. They're saying the point of the decline is when people figure out that they can, by majority rule, vote themselves largesse or gifts or money from that government if they just get in the majority as the democracy. The late 1800s, a guy named Benjamin Disraeli said this 100 years later. He said, "Great nations rise and fall. The people go from bondage to spiritual truth, to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, and from dependence back again to bondage." And as you look at that, you wonder, where are we? Where are we on that? If I had to pick it out, I'd say we're in dependence. Entitlements and feeling like the government owes us to provide for us. And we've moved farther along than we really want to think about on that. And we don't want to think about the next step. You know, during Paul's day in this Roman government, part of what they did, and part of what, if you visit Rome, you'll see the Colosseum, and they would fill the Colosseum with 50,000 people. And part of what they would do there is they would have Christians whose lives were taken by wild animals or they were murdered there for sport. But you know, at the same time that was going on in the Colosseum, that underneath the streets of Rome were places called catacombs. These tombs where people were buried, where Christians would meet in secrecy and pray for things to change. You know, that's where it's all going to start. When the government is a reflection of us as a prayerful people. When the government is a reflection of us as a people committed to God at whatever cost. The Bible says that in 2 Chronicles 7:14, when my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will heal their land. The first step is recognizing where we are. The second step is using our freedom that we do have and using it properly. But all that will make no difference unless we become the kind of people that God can begin to use to change our society, to change hearts, to get truth out there. And then our government will begin to reflect a people whose heart is toward God. I don't know what God has in store for America in the next decades, but I pray that He will do whatever He needs to do to get us back to being this kind of people. And we may not like what He has to do, but it will be best for us if He does it. It'll be best for our kids. It'll be best for our grandchildren. If God does whatever He does to break the cycle we looked at and to get us back to the point of being the spiritual people who started this country, who had a heart for Him, and get us back to being that kind of people so we can start again another 200 years, but start to be the people that can change this world and change people all around us for the cause of Christ. Would you bow with me?